Welcome back to Beyond the Case. Before we begin, remember to like, comment, and hit the subscribe button so you never miss another deep dive into the world's most puzzling disappearances. Today's episode takes us into one of the most disturbing and debated missing person cases in American history. A case that began like any other, quiet, ordinary, almost forgettable, until it spiraled into a story so layered and haunting that even now, more than 4 decades later, it continues to leave investigators, journalists, and families divided, questioning what is truth and what is myth. This is the disappearance of Johnny Gosch, a 12-year-old boy from a peaceful Iowa suburb who stepped out into the early morning light to deliver newspapers and was never truly seen again. Or so the story goes. It was the morning of Sunday, the 5th of September, 1982, the kind of morning where the world feels half asleep, the sun still beneath the horizon, the air crisp, the neighborhood still. West Des Moines at this time was a quiet, comfortable community. Parents felt safe letting their children roam freely. Paper routes were considered harmless routines that taught responsibility and independence. There was nothing unusual about seeing a young boy out before sunrise pulling a wagon full of newspapers behind him. Johnny Gosch had done this many times before. Normally, his father walked with him, but the night before, Johnny had asked permission to go alone. His father had said no, yet for reasons still unknown, and perhaps reasons that haunt him to this very day, Johnny left the house alone anyway. He would never return. Witnesses later recalled seeing Johnny at several points along his route. His small wagon full of Des Moines Register newspapers followed him faithfully, its wheels rattling softly against the pavement. Then came the car, an older model Ford, Fairmont by some accounts. Light in color, perhaps blue, perhaps silver. Memory is a fragile thing, especially under stress. But multiple witnesses, all unrelated, described the same detail. A man pulled up beside Johnny and asked for directions. Nothing overtly strange, nothing that seemed to demand urgency. But according to another paper boy, moments later, Johnny confided that the man had made him a little scared. That brief expression of unease would become one of the final things anyone ever heard from him. The car moved on, turned a corner, parked, waited. Moments later, according to witnesses, two men, whose faces remain unclear, whose names and identities were never confirmed, grabbed Johnny from the street. They were swift, coordinated, as if this had been planned, practiced. One witness claimed the boy was carried to the car. Another said he heard the screech of tires as the vehicle sped away, disappearing into the darkness of early morning. It happened fast, too fast for anyone to react. But the most haunting part? No one immediately called the police. Not a single witness dialed for help. Not one person reached out, not until much later. And by then, precious hours had been lost. It wasn't law enforcement that first noticed something was wrong. It was the families along Johnny's route. Their newspapers simply weren't arriving. One phone call after another, confusion turning into concern. Concern spilling over into fear. Johnny's father retraced the route himself, and there, abandoned near the curb, he found the wagon, stacked neatly with the papers that were never delivered. He said he knew instantly, instinctively, that something terrible had happened. Johnny was not the kind of boy who wandered off. He was responsible, mature beyond his years. His disappearance made no sense. Not to his father, not to his mother, Noreen, not to anyone who knew him. When the Gosh family called the police, desperation in their voices, they expected urgency, action, a mobilized search. Instead, they were told something else. Authorities insisted Johnny was probably a runaway, despite his abandoned wagon, multiple witnesses describing a suspicious man, sightings of a struggle, and the sound of a car speeding away. Even with these details, law enforcement held firm. This was a runaway case. To the Gosches, this felt like a dismissive blow. To some investigators years later, it remains one of the most baffling missteps in the entire investigation. From the very first day, Noreen Gosh refused to accept the runaway theory. She insisted her son had been taken, and she insisted on action. But when none came, she turned to the community. Neighbors, friends, strangers, they assembled quickly, forming their own search party. They combed fields, neighborhoods, wooded areas. They distributed flyers, knocked on doors, and spread the word far beyond their city. Noreen contacted local news, then national news. The story spread. Soon Johnny's name was known far beyond Iowa. His photo, wide-eyed, smiling, became one of the first missing children's faces printed on milk cartons across the United States, a symbol of a growing epidemic. But even as the story gained attention, leads were scarce, theories multiplied, contradictions piled up, and with each passing week, the case drifted further away from clarity and deeper into mystery. Over the years, many unusual details would emerge. Claims, sightings, confessions, and contradictions that would twist this case into something few could have predicted. But in these early days, those first hours, those first weeks, what mattered most was the truth that became painfully clear. Johnny Gosh did not simply vanish. Something happened to him that morning. Something deliberate. Something coordinated. Something far bigger than anyone first imagined. And for Noreen, this realization was only the beginning, because she believed that whoever took Johnny did not act alone and did not act randomly. She believed this was part of something larger, something darker, something organized, and soon she would devote her life to uncovering it. In the days following Johnny's disappearance, while the rest of West Des Moines struggled to understand what had happened, one person seemed to possess a clarity that others did not. His mother, Noreen Gosh. For her, the idea of Johnny running away was inconceivable. It wasn't denial. It wasn't hope clouding her reasoning. It was a simple truth she knew in her bones. Johnny was not a runaway. He was taken. And if the authorities weren't going to search for him, then she would. Within hours, Noreen launched what would become one of the most relentless and emotionally charged private investigations in American true crime history. She contacted every major news outlet she could, local channels, radio stations, newspapers, anyone who would listen. She stood in front of cameras, exhausted but composed, pleading for awareness, for action, for help. It was not loud or dramatic. It was the quiet determination of a mother who refused to let her child become a statistic. Her message was simple. My son did not run away. He was kidnapped. Please help me bring him home. The story spread, and the nation watched. As more people heard about the case, individuals who had been hesitant or even afraid to speak up began sharing what they had seen. A woman recalled seeing the strange Ford Fairmont driving erratically near the area. A man said he noticed two figures struggling near the street that morning. Another paper carrier confirmed Johnny looked frightened after speaking to the man in the car. Piece by piece, a disturbing picture began to form. But even with this new information, law enforcement's stance did not shift. They continued to operate under the assumption that Johnny had left on his own. For the Gosch family, this was more than frustrating. It was devastating, because every hour wasted under the wrong assumption was an hour they could never get back. Feeling abandoned by the very system meant to protect her child, Noreen made a decision that few parents would ever imagine having to make. She took over the investigation herself. She organized search teams. She distributed flyers across multiple states. She reached out to private investigators. She knocked on doors and interviewed witnesses personally. Her determination was unshakable. But behind her strength, there was a quiet fear. A fear that every new lead might be the one that broke her heart. A fear that every dead end might be the end of all hope. Yet still, she kept moving. In cases of suspected kidnapping, especially those with the possibility of crossing state lines, the Federal Bureau of Investigation is typically alerted immediately. But in 1982, things did not go as expected. When Noreen reached out to the FBI, she encountered resistance. Officials explained that they could not get involved unless there was definitive proof that Johnny had been taken across state boundaries. A frustrating technicality, a rule that made little sense to a desperate mother, a rule that, looking back, may have cost invaluable time. Still, Noreen refused to stop pushing. She demanded answers. She demanded help. She demanded that someone, anyone, take her son's disappearance seriously. But as the days passed, it became painfully clear that if progress was going to be made, it would come from her efforts, not from official channels. Weeks after Johnny's disappearance, a surprising phone call came in. A woman in a convenience store several states away in Oklahoma claimed that a frantic young boy ran toward her, screaming that he had been kidnapped, that his name was Johnny, that he needed help. She said that before she could react, two men grabbed the child and dragged him away. She never saw him again. The description of the boy matched Johnny, the timing matched, and the desperation in the witness's voice left Noreen shaken. Yet, despite how alarming this sighting was, it remained only an unconfirmed report, one of many that would surface over the years. Still, it was something to cling to, something to push forward with. And Noreen did exactly that. Months turned into seasons, and seasons turned into years. But the story did not fade. More and more people began contacting the Gosch family with items, notes, or sightings they believed might be connected. One of the most shocking came in the form of a simple dollar bill. A man mailed the family a note explaining that he had come into possession of a dollar with something written across its surface. The words were small, pressed tightly between the creases. "I am alive. Johnny Gosh." The Gosh family immediately mailed the man a new dollar in exchange for the marked one. When Noreen examined it, she felt a cold wave wash over her. She recognized the handwriting, the slanted letters, the uneven spacing. She believed it was Johnny's. To others, it was an odd story, a strange coincidence, something that could have easily been forged. But to Noreen, it was her son reaching out from somewhere he could not stay, somewhere he needed to escape from. Not long after, a similar message surfaced in Denver, Colorado. Another dollar bill, this one stained with red nail polish. On it, the words, "Johnny Gosh was here." Investigators were quick to dismiss it. Prank, coincidence, mischief. But for a mother with no answers, these messages were fragments of hope. Painful hope, fragile hope, but hope nonetheless. As time went on, a disturbing theory began to take root among private investigators and advocates connected to the case. The theory claimed that Johnny's disappearance was not random, that he had not been targeted as an isolated victim. Instead, it suggested he had become part of a wider, far more horrifying network, a network involving trafficking, manipulation, exploitation, and secrecy. For Noreen, this theory was not unthinkable. It was the only explanation that made sense of the unusual details surrounding Johnny's abduction. The odd car, the coordinated grab, the secrecy, the continued sightings. And her mother's intuition told her that, if this theory was correct, Johnny might still be alive, but he might also be suffering in ways she could hardly bear to imagine. By now, most families would have collapsed under the weight of fear, grief, and unanswered questions. But Noreen kept going. She attended conferences devoted to missing children. She connected with other families living through similar nightmares. She built networks with investigators, advocates, and journalists. Her home became a command center of sorts. Boxes filled with letters, reports, newspaper articles, statements, photos, and anything that might, even remotely, bring her closer to Johnny. She didn't rest. She didn't step back. Not even when exhaustion threatened to overwhelm her. Because to her, stepping back meant giving up, and giving up meant losing Johnny forever. By the mid-1980s, Johnny's case had become one of the most well-known missing child stories in the country. His photo appeared on milk cartons nationwide, one of the first children ever to be granted that spotlight. Talk shows, news broadcasts, documentaries, they all featured his story, and with attention came pressure. Pressure on law enforcement, pressure on politicians, pressure on agencies that had been slow to respond. People began to ask questions. Why wasn't more done early on? Why were the witnesses not taken seriously? Why did the runaway theory persist so forcefully? The case became larger than one missing boy. It became a symbol of systemic shortcomings, a delicate, uncomfortable reminder that not all children who go missing receive swift justice. As the years passed, Noreen's search took her to places she never imagined. She interviewed traumatized young men who claimed they had been part of the same network Johnny was allegedly taken into. Some said they had seen him. Some said they had spoken with him. Some said they had survived horrors that no child should ever face. These stories were complex, painful, controversial, but they also aligned with pieces of information Noreen had gathered over the years. It was no longer just a mother's hunch. It was a growing body of claims, reports, and testimonies suggesting something far bigger was at play. Something organized, something hidden, something frighteningly powerful. And though many people doubted her, Noreen pressed on, because she believed that somewhere, out there, her son was still alive, still hoping, still waiting, for someone to find him, for someone to expose the truth, for someone to help him come home. By the mid-1980s, the disappearance of Johnny Gosch had become more than a missing persons case. It had evolved into a tangled puzzle, one in which every piece raised new questions, new doubts, and new possibilities. For some, the story was becoming too strange, too complicated. For others, especially those who had followed the case closely, it felt like the system had failed one boy, and a determined mother was filling the void left behind. And through it all, one truth remained constant. Johnny had never been found, not officially, not unquestionably, not in a way that brought closure. Yet evidence, if it could be called that, kept arriving. People kept coming forward, and each new revelation pushed the story further away from simplicity and deeper into uncertainty. As months slipped into years, Noreen realized she could not navigate the maze alone. So she hired a private investigator, someone willing to explore the leads that authorities would not. The investigator, whose name remained mostly behind the scenes, approached the case with a fresh perspective. Without the restraints of official procedures or rigid assumptions, he began pulling on threads others had overlooked. He interviewed people outside the initial witness circle. He tracked down tips sent anonymously by mail. He pieced together sightings from across several states. And slowly a pattern emerged. One that suggested Johnny had not been harmed immediately. One that pointed to movement, travel, relocation. One that hinted he could still be alive. It was a fragile hope, but it kept the Gosch family fighting. As the investigator continued digging, unusual accounts began to surface. Young men, some now older, came forward claiming experiences that mirrored the circumstances surrounding Johnny's disappearance. Their stories were complicated, emotional, and often difficult to verify. But they shared striking similarities. A sudden disappearance, transport across states, a group of adults who controlled their movements, fear, isolation, and years later, escape. Some of them claimed that within their ordeal, they had met Johnny, that they had spoken with him, that they had seen him struggling but alive. These accounts were not definitive proof, but they were not isolated incidents either. For Noreen, the testimonies were heartbreaking, but they offered something the official investigation never had, the possibility that her son was still out there. The more Noreen spoke publicly, the more resistance she faced. Critics accused her of exaggeration. Others accused her of delusion. Some accused her of exploiting the tragedy, ignoring the fact that she had never once stopped searching. Documentaries, interviews, and talk shows featured her story. With each appearance, she hoped someone, anyone, would come forward with new information. But visibility also brought backlash. People questioned her credibility. Some labeled her theories impossible. Others insisted she was refusing to accept grief. Yet through all the skepticism, Noreen remained clear and consistent. She believed her son had been taken as part of an organized group. She believed he was alive, and she believed he needed her voice. Her resolve never wavered. In the mid-1990s, long after the world assumed Johnny's case had gone cold, new developments emerged. Some were small, anonymous letters, unconfirmed sightings, vague recollections from people who had been children at the time. Others were more significant. One young man claimed that during his teenage years, he had been held in a similar environment to what Noreen suspected. He insisted Johnny had been there too. He described a boy with similar features, similar habits, and a quiet, withdrawn demeanor. Noreen listened carefully. She never sensationalized. She never exaggerated his words. She simply collected the account, added it to her growing archive, and kept searching for the truth. Behind the public story, there was a private one, a quieter, more painful narrative that often goes unseen in true crime cases. Johnny's disappearance changed everything for the Gosch family. It strained relationships. It created sleepless nights. Endless research and emotional exhaustion. It turned their home into a center of operations filled with paperwork, photographs, letters, and files, and it left a lingering sense of grief that never fully settled. True crime cases often focus on the mystery, the unexplainable, the clues and theories. But behind every missing child is a family living through the kind of uncertainty that few people can imagine. For the Gosches, every news report brought hope and fear. Every phone call could be a breakthrough or a cruel false alarm. Every quiet moment reminded them of the boy who should have been home. Johnny's room remained untouched for years, a symbol of hope, a reminder of what they had lost, and a promise that they would never give up. By the late 1990s, something happened that would permanently reshape the narrative. An event so startling and so heavily debated that it became one of the most talked about claims in the entire case. It began on an ordinary night, one of those quiet moments when the world feels still, when grief settles heavily across the mind, and exhaustion weighs on every limb. Noreen had been asleep when a knock echoed through her home. She approached the door cautiously, looked through the peephole, and saw two young men standing outside. What happened next would become one of the most controversial statements ever made in a missing persons investigation. One of the young men spoke, "Mom, it's me, Johnny." Noreen later said that everything inside her recognized him immediately. The eyes, the voice, the posture. 15 years had passed. He was no longer a 12-year-old boy. He was a young man, older, shaped by time and circumstances impossible to comprehend. But she believed it was him. She said he came inside, that he stayed only a short time, that he was anxious, afraid, and constantly watching the windows. He told her he could not stay, that he was still in danger, that he needed her help exposing what had happened to him. Then he left, disappearing once again into a world she could not reach. This account has been debated endlessly. Some believe her, others doubt it. Many are simply unsure. But regardless of where the truth lies, the moment became a defining chapter in the case's legacy. Because for a brief window in time, Noreen believed her son had come home. After the alleged visit, the case entered a new phase. Theories multiplied. Skeptics grew louder. Supporters grew more determined. But through all the noise, one fact remained unchanged. Johnny's whereabouts were still unknown. And so Noreen shifted her mission. She had spent years searching for one boy, her boy, but she had also uncovered systemic issues far larger than one case. She began speaking not just for Johnny, but for all missing children. For children who disappeared without a trace. For families left behind. For others whose voices were not heard. Her advocacy reshaped national awareness. She helped inspire policies, inspire discussions, and inspire change. Over time, the story of Johnny Gosh became not only the story of a missing child, but a reminder of how vulnerable children can be, and how determined one mother can become when faced with the unimaginable. Decades have passed since that early September morning. But the case continues to ripple through the world of true crime. Books have been written, documentaries released, interviews recorded, research conducted. Every few years, new people discover the story and find themselves pulled into its depths, into the mystery, into the unanswered questions, and into the quiet sadness that surrounds it. Yet despite all the theories, all the reports, and all the speculation, one truth remains. There has never been definitive proof of what happened to Johnny Gosh. Not truly, not conclusively, not in a way that could finally bring the story to rest, and perhaps that is why his case endures. Because unresolved stories have a way of staying alive. They linger in the mind. They remind us of how fragile safety can be and how strong a parent's love can become. As the 1980s came to a close, the disappearance of Johnny Gosh had evolved into something much larger than any single investigation. What began as the quiet vanishing of a 12-year-old paperboy was now a national conversation about safety, accountability, and the troubling gaps in child protection systems. And for countless families across America, the case served as a painful mirror, reflecting their own fears about the vulnerabilities their children faced in a rapidly changing world. But for Noreen, The conversation was not theoretical. It was personal. It was daily. And it was relentless. She had not found Johnny. She had not received closure. But she had gained something else. A platform. A voice. And a mission far beyond what she ever expected. As media outlets continued revisiting Johnny's story, Noreen found herself becoming one of the most recognizable child advocacy voices in the country. She spoke at conferences focused on missing children. She provided testimony at policy discussions. She helped raise awareness in communities that had once believed such tragedies could never reach their neighborhoods. Her work was not fueled by recognition or praise. It was fueled by grief, responsibility, and a belief that no family should have to experience the same failures she had faced. And soon, national organizations took notice. One of the young men spoke, "Mom, it's me, Johnny." Noreen later said that everything inside her recognized him immediately. The eyes, the voice, the posture. 15 years had passed. He was no longer a 12-year-old boy. He was a young man, older, shaped by time and circumstances impossible to comprehend. But she believed it was him. She said he came inside, that he stayed only a short time, that he was anxious, afraid, and constantly watching the windows. He told her he could not stay, that he was still in danger, that he needed her help exposing what had happened to him. Then he left, disappearing once again into a world she could not reach. This account has been debated endlessly. Some believe her, others doubt it. Many are simply unsure. But regardless of where the truth lies, the moment became a defining chapter in the case's legacy. Because for a brief window in time, Noreen believed her son had come home. After the alleged visit, the case entered a new phase. Theories multiplied. Skeptics grew louder. Supporters grew more determined. But through all the noise, one fact remained unchanged. Johnny's whereabouts were still unknown. And so Noreen shifted her mission. She had spent years searching for one boy, her boy, but she had also uncovered systemic issues far larger than one case. She began speaking not just for Johnny, but for all missing children, for children who disappeared without a trace, for families left behind, for others whose voices were not heard. Her advocacy reshaped national awareness. She helped inspire policies, inspire discussions, and inspire change. Over time, the story of Johnny Gosh became not only the story of a missing child, but a reminder of how vulnerable children can be, and how determined one mother can become when faced with the unimaginable. Decades have passed since that early September morning. But the case continues to ripple through the world of true crime. Books have been written, documentaries released, interviews recorded, research conducted. Every few years, new people discover the story and find themselves pulled into its depths, into the mystery, into the unanswered questions, and into the quiet sadness that surrounds it. Yet despite all the theories, all the reports, and all the speculation, one truth remains. There has never been definitive proof of what happened to Johnny Gosh. Not truly, not conclusively, not in a way that could finally bring the story to rest. And perhaps that is why his case endures. Because unresolved stories have a way of staying alive. They linger in the mind. They remind us of how fragile safety can be and how strong a parent's love can become. As the 1980s came to a close, the disappearance of Johnny Gosh had evolved into something much larger than any single investigation. What began as the quiet vanishing of a 12-year-old paperboy was now a national conversation about safety, accountability, and the troubling gaps in child protection systems. And for countless families across America, the case served as a painful mirror, reflecting their own fears about the vulnerabilities their children faced in a rapidly changing world. But for Noreen, the conversation was not theoretical. It was personal, it was daily, and it was relentless. She had not found Johnny, she had not received closure, but she had gained something else, a platform, a voice, and a mission far beyond what she ever expected. As media outlets continued revisiting Johnny's story, Noreen found herself becoming one of the most recognizable child advocacy voices in the country. She spoke at conferences focused on missing children. She provided testimony at policy discussions. She helped raise awareness in communities that had once believed such tragedies could never reach their neighborhoods. Her work was not fueled by recognition or praise. It was fueled by grief, responsibility, and a belief that no family should have to experience the same failures she had faced. And soon national organizations took notice. From early missing children organizations to groups supporting families in crisis, Noreen's presence was welcomed. She possessed lived experience that could not be taught, and determination that few could match. Her message was clear and unwavering. Children do not simply vanish. Someone somewhere knows something, and communities must remain vigilant. Before Johnny's disappearance, missing children rarely received large-scale public attention. Photos were shared locally, posters placed in a child's immediate area, but rarely did information spread far beyond state lines. But beginning in the mid-80s, things changed. Johnny became one of the first children whose face appeared on the backs of milk cartons across the country, a program designed to reach millions of families in their kitchens every morning. His image, printed beneath the words, "Missing Child," traveled into households nationwide. Children asked their parents about him. Parents stopped to read the tiny description. People who had never heard of West Des Moines now knew the name Johnny Gosh. It was a bittersweet success. A painful reminder of how widespread the crisis of missing children had become, but also a powerful tool that gave families hope. This shift in national awareness helped reshape public understanding. It emphasized that the loss of one child was a loss felt by all. And for Noreen, every milk carton, every poster, every headline represented a chance, a small chance, that someone might come forward with a lead that could change everything. The growing attention placed pressure on the very agencies that had once treated Johnny's case with skepticism. Law enforcement departments across the country were beginning to see the consequences of slow responses, misjudgments, and outdated assumptions. The runaway label, once used frequently in cases of missing children, was now being re-examined. For the West Des Moines Police Department, Johnny's case became a point of criticism and reflection. Questions were asked. Why were key witnesses not immediately interviewed? Why was the runaway theory maintained despite contradictory evidence? Why did the investigation not escalate sooner? Though the department issued statements defending their early decisions, many observers felt the case demonstrated the need for significant reform. And in time, reforms would come. Stricter protocols, faster alerts, mandatory immediate responses to suspected abductions. Changes that may not have arrived without the public pressure surrounding cases like Johnny's. The further the case stretched into the years, the more rumors began to surface. Some were small, whispers from neighbors, vague recollections, stories from people claiming to have heard something. Others were far more dramatic. Some individuals claimed there were people in positions of influence who did not want the truth exposed. Others claimed information had been withheld or overlooked, and some insisted the case connected to wider issues that the public was not ready to confront. Rumors, by their nature, are easy to spread and difficult to verify. But in true crime stories, they complicate everything. They muddy the water, they pull investigators in countless directions, and they add heavy emotional weight to families who are already overwhelmed. For Noreen, rumors were both blessing and curse. A blessing because some rumors led to tips worth following. A curse because others wasted precious time and emotional capacity. But she followed every credible lead, no matter how faint the trail. She believed she owed Johnny nothing less. Throughout the 1980s and 90s, journalists frequently revisited the case. Some reported with compassion and respect. Others pursued sensational angles that overshadowed the family's actual mission. For the Gosches, this was a difficult balance. Media attention was essential, but it also brought scrutiny, misinterpretation, and, for the first time, public doubt aimed at the family itself. Some questioned Noreen's claims. Some questioned her emotional state. Some even questioned the possibility of Johnny being alive. But no matter the angle, the one undeniable truth was that the story never disappeared from public memory. People cared. People wanted answers. And long after most cases would have faded from conversation, Johnny's story continued to echo. Even without conclusive breakthroughs, the case began indirectly shaping change in ways few could have predicted. Child safety laws were strengthened. Protocols for investigating missing children modernized. Interagency cooperation improved. Communities were educated on warning signs and best practices. Schools launched new programs on child safety. Media outlets became quicker to share missing children's information. The case also helped encourage the push for what would become the Amber Alert system in later years, an important tool for mobilizing communities quickly when a child goes missing. Johnny's story, though unresolved, contributed to a nationwide shift in how society responds to endangered children. And through every interview, every documentary appearance, and every speech, Noreen reminded the world, if it can happen to my child, it can happen to anyone's. By the turn of the millennium, Noreen had spent nearly 2 decades pursuing answers. The passage of time did not lessen her resolve, it reshaped it. She realized she was no longer fighting solely for the truth about her son. She was fighting for countless other families who lacked the resources, visibility, or support she had fought so hard to build. She founded the Johnny Gosh Foundation, an organization meant to educate the public about the dangers of trafficking, abduction, and child exploitation. Through the foundation, she worked to empower parents with knowledge she had once lacked. Seminars, pamphlets, interviews, everything she produced carried the same underlying message. Awareness saves lives, education prevents tragedies, and silence protects the wrong people. Her advocacy made her a respected figure in the fight for children's safety. Yet privately, she carried an unspoken burden, a question that haunted her each night. Was Johnny still alive? And if so, where was he? In the early years, when Noreen insisted her son had been taken and not run away, many dismissed her. When she suggested organized exploitation networks, critics claimed she was exaggerating. When she reported potential sightings and messages, some insisted she was clinging to false hope. But over time, society began to confront uncomfortable truths about exploitation rings, trafficking networks, and systemic failures. As cases similar to Johnny's emerged nationwide, the claims once ridiculed began to look less impossible. The world was changing. People were listening. And the uncomfortable reality was that Noreen had been raising valid concerns long before the rest of the country acknowledged them. It was not vindication she sought, only truth. Truth that might bring her son home, truth that might prevent another child from suffering, and truth that would remind people that behind every headline, behind every missing poster, behind every cold case, there is a child who deserves answers. More than a decade had passed since Johnny Gosh stepped into the stillness of an early September morning and vanished. Yet unlike most missing person cases that fade quietly into the archives, Johnny's story only grew more tangled with time. It was a case that refused to die, a case that resurfaced every few years with new leads, new claims, and new controversies. A case that forced investigators, journalists, and families to confront the uncomfortable truth that sometimes answers do not come easily, or at all. And at the center of it all stood a mother who refused to surrender to silence. As the 1990s approached, a surprising phenomenon began unfolding. Young men, some now adults, reached out to Noreen, each with their own story. These were not stories told lightly or casually. They were emotional, hesitant, and often painful. Some claimed they had been held by groups exploiting vulnerable young people. Some said they had been moved from place to place, kept hidden from the outside world. And some said, quietly, with trembling certainty, that they had seen Johnny during their ordeal. They described a young boy who matched his appearance, a quiet demeanor, a frightened expression, a child who kept mostly to himself, as though he had been conditioned to avoid drawing attention. None of these testimonies could be fully verified. Some were impossible to prove. Others were vague, fragmented by the trauma of the individuals sharing them. But taken together, they painted a picture, a disturbing, haunting picture that aligned with the theories Noreen and her private investigators had believed for years. It was not proof, but it was something, another thread to weave into the larger tapestry of unanswered questions. One of the most controversial developments occurred in the early 2000s, when 3 disturbing photographs surfaced anonymously in the mail and were later shared with Noreen. These images depicted several boys restrained in ways that suggested captivity or control. One of the boys, some believed, resembled Johnny around the age of 14. Law enforcement evaluated the pictures and concluded that at least some of them appeared to be unrelated to Johnny and possibly part of an old resolved case from many years prior. But for Noreen, the resemblance was striking. She believed one of the boys could have been her son. Even though the photos were never proven to be connected to Johnny, their emergence reignited nationwide conversation, once again bringing attention to the case and to Noreen's decades-long claims about organized networks. Some dismissed the connection. Some insisted she was mistaken. But others wondered, what if the photographs represented a truth that had been overlooked? What if the face in the image was a reminder of a boy lost but still alive somewhere? The debate intensified, adding yet another layer of complexity to the already convoluted case. There is a unique kind of suffering reserved for the families of missing children. A grief without closure, a wound without healing, a question without an answer. Most grieving families eventually face acceptance, but families of the missing live in a different reality. Every day carries the weight of possibility. A knock at the door could be good news or devastating news. A phone call could bring clarity or more confusion. A new witness could be truthful or mistaken. Hope becomes both a comfort and a torment. For the Gosch family, this emotional state became the new normal. Holidays were marked not by celebration, but by silence. Birthdays passed with photographs of a boy who never aged, and each passing year added another layer of longing. Johnny's absence shaped their lives in ways that cannot be measured. His empty room, his untouched belongings, his memory frozen in time, and the dread that came from not knowing. Was he alive? Was he suffering? Was he out there trying to find his way home? These questions haunted Noreen through the passing decades. Perhaps the most debated moment in the entire narrative came 15 years after the disappearance, in the late 1990s. Noreen claimed that on one quiet night, she heard a knock at her door. When she looked out, she saw two young men. One stepped forward and said words she would never forget. "Mom, it's me, Johnny." According to her, they spoke inside for a brief period. She said the young man looked like Johnny, older but undeniably him. He spoke quietly, nervously, as though constantly checking that no one had followed him. He allegedly told her he was still in danger, that he could not stay, that he needed her to continue pushing for justice. Then he left, stepping back into the unknown as suddenly as he had appeared. Noreen's claims sparked national debate. Some believed her wholeheartedly. Some doubted the possibility. Some accused her of misidentifying someone in a moment of emotional vulnerability. There was no photographic proof, no recorded evidence, no witnesses beyond Noreen herself. And yet she never wavered in her retelling of the event. To her, it was real. It was her son, and it was the last time she ever saw him. The alleged visit divided the public. Some felt the story strengthened her claims about Johnny's abduction and survival. Others felt it added confusion and fueled skepticism. Debates unfolded on talk shows, in newspapers, and across communities invested in the case. Psychologists weighed in on the emotional complexity of long-term grief. Journalists questioned why no physical evidence accompanied the encounter. Despite the controversy, one undeniable effect emerged. The case re-entered national conversation. Documentaries revisited the story. Investigators re-examined old leads. Advocates reignited discussions about child safety and systemic gaps. The mystery of Johnny Gosch had once again become a topic of urgent interest. In the year 2000, nearly 2 decades after the disappearance, Noreen published a detailed, emotionally charged account of her journey titled, "Why Johnny Can't Come Home." The book offered her timeline of events, the evidence she had collected, and the testimonies she believed supported her theories. It described the bureaucratic roadblocks she faced, the private investigators she worked with, and the individuals she met who claimed to have information about Johnny. The book was not simply a memoir. It was a catalog of unanswered questions and unexplored possibilities. Critics argued the book included claims that were difficult to prove. Supporters praised her bravery for speaking openly about a subject many found uncomfortable. Regardless of perspective, the book ensured that Johnny's story remained part of the national dialogue. It reminded the world that behind every mystery, there is a real family longing for answers, not theories, not opinions, but truth. By the early 2000s, law enforcement had conducted additional reviews of the case. Despite new technology, updated investigative methods, and increased awareness, no definitive breakthroughs emerged. The case remained open, not closed, not solved, simply open. A file that continued to sit on shelves, waiting for the one piece of evidence that could change everything. For some investigators, the lack of resolution was frustrating. For others, it was expected, a reflection of just how complicated the case had become. But for Noreen, there was only one conclusion she held on to. Johnny was out there somewhere, and someone somewhere knew the truth. Johnny's disappearance left a mark on more than just his family or even his community. It reshaped national understanding of how vulnerable children can be. It influenced policy. It inspired countless advocacy groups. It encouraged schools and parents to take safety more seriously. It pushed for reforms in how law enforcement responds to missing child reports. More importantly, it taught the world that even in the absence of answers, voices matter, awareness matters, persistence matters, because one missing child is never just one child. Every story represents a family, a community, and a society responsible for its youngest members. As the years passed, the disappearance of Johnny Gosh remained suspended in a delicate space between fact and speculation, truth and rumor, hope and heartache. In many missing children cases, time brings clarity, leads emerge, evidence strengthens, the fog slowly lifts. But in Johnny's case, time only deepened the shadows. Every answer seemed to lead to another question. Every discovery opened new doors instead of closing old ones. And every passing year seemed to confirm that the mystery was far more complicated than anyone could have imagined on that quiet September morning so long ago. For Noreen, the journey had become more than a search. It had become a commitment, a promise to her son, and a responsibility to every parent who feared their child might disappear into similar darkness. But the truth is rarely simple, and the truth in this case seemed endlessly out of reach. By the time the early 2000s arrived, Johnny's disappearance had become one of the most discussed and debated missing child cases in American history. The story had crossed state lines, crossed decades, crossed generations, and crossed the line between what people knew and what they feared might be true. Documentaries revisited the case often, each approaching the story with a slightly different angle. Some focused on the abduction. Others explored the inconsistent early investigation. Some emphasized the testimonies of young men who claimed to have encountered Johnny, and others centered around Noreen's persistent belief that her son had survived. This widespread attention kept the case alive, but it also created challenges. The more people learned about the story, the more complex their interpretations became. Some viewers felt overwhelming sympathy for the Gosch family. Others became skeptical of certain claims. Some wondered whether the truth had become tangled in decades of fear, trauma, and unanswered questions. But through every shift in public opinion, one fact remained unshakable. Johnny Gosch had never been found. As the timeline expanded, the narrative became harder to untangle. There were witness accounts, anonymous tips, unverified sightings, conflicting memories, and moments where speculation blended into theory. Some of the accounts seemed credible. Others seemed uncertain. A few seemed impossible to fully verify. True crime investigators know that memory is fragile. Trauma affects recollection. People may unintentionally fill in gaps. Some witnesses feel pressure to help, even when their memories are unclear. Others fear speaking out. In Johnny's case, investigators faced all these challenges at once. Theories began to swirl, not because the case was simple, but because it was complicated, confusing, and at times overwhelming. And as years turned into decades, the truth became harder to separate from everything surrounding it. For law enforcement, this made the case difficult to approach. For the public, it made the case endlessly haunting. For Noreen, it deepened her resolve. Some tips suggested that Johnny had been taken across state lines. Others suggested he had been moved often to avoid detection. A few hinted he may have been relocated outside the country entirely. None of these leads were ever conclusively confirmed, but they created a picture of a child on the move, a child whose safety depended on not staying in one place too long. Private investigators followed many of these leads. They traveled. They interviewed. They collected stories from people who believed they had seen a boy who resembled Johnny. Some sightings came from truck stops, bus stations, rest areas, coastal regions, and border towns. Every report earned careful consideration, but each one ended the same, without definitive proof. Still, these sightings kept the case from fading. They kept the possibility alive. They kept the public engaged. And for Noreen, they kept hope alive, even when hope felt fragile. Perhaps the most painful aspect of Johnny's case was not the lack of answers, but the abundance of possibilities. What if he was alive for many years after the abduction? What if he tried to reach out? What if he escaped and lived in fear, unable to safely return home? What if he remained hidden because he believed he had no other choice? These questions weighed heavily on Noreen, shaping her understanding of the world, changing the way she saw people and institutions. The uncertainty became its own form of grief, one that never fully settles, never fully resolves. To grieving families of the missing, uncertainty is often the hardest part to bear, because while closure is painful, limbo can be unbearable. And yet, despite the emotional toll, Noreen continued her work tirelessly. Over time, the narrative divided into two broad perspectives. Those who believed Johnny survived. People in this group felt that the eyewitness accounts, messages, and alleged photographs were too consistent to ignore. They believed that the mother's testimony, especially regarding the alleged visit, held truth. They believed the case involved organized movement and long-term survival. Those who believed the evidence was insufficient, others argued that memories fade, that claims made years after the fact are difficult to verify, that emotional trauma can create layers of belief that feel real, even when they cannot be confirmed. And some believed the alleged visit to Noreen's home was a case of mistaken identity or emotional hope. Yet both perspectives had something in common. They cared. They wanted answers. They wanted resolution for the family and justice for the boy who disappeared while simply doing his morning job. This rare overlap is what kept the story alive for so long. People were invested, emotionally, morally, humanly. Even without a resolution, Johnny's disappearance changed the landscape of child safety in the United States. It influenced missing child advocacy, public awareness campaigns, law enforcement training, early versions of what would later become the Amber Alert system, national conversations about how missing cases should be handled. Johnny's name appears in countless discussions of missing child reform, symbolizing both the failures of early investigation and the power of relentless advocacy. His story has been taught in university criminal justice classes, referenced in documentaries, discussed in investigative podcasts, and analyzed in books exploring flaws in missing child protocols. Johnny's case mattered, not only to his family, but to an entire nation learning how to better protect its children. As the second decade of the 2000s approached, the official case files remained open. Not active, not officially closed, just open. Waiting, watching, waiting for one more tip, one more confession, one more photograph, one more detail that might finally crack the mystery wide open. Because cases like Johnny's rarely reach a clean ending. They remain living stories, evolving with time, expanding with each new voice that enters the conversation. And despite the years, despite the distance from that September morning, despite the countless twists and turns, someone, somewhere, knows the truth. And every so often a new detail emerges. A whisper, a message, a recollection, suggesting the story is not finished yet. By the time the new millennium settled in, the disappearance of Johnny Gosch had become more than a cold case. It had become a landmark in American missing child history, a story woven into the fabric of public consciousness, a story studied by criminologists, advocates, journalists, and families searching for answers about their own missing loved ones. But more than anything, it had become a story of endurance. Endurance in the face of uncertainty, endurance in the face of skepticism, endurance in the face of a world that kept moving forward while one mother's life remained frozen on a single date in the early 1980s. For Noreen, that endurance carried her through the darkest years, but it also fueled something else, a legacy that stretched far beyond her own family's suffering. In the early 2000s, child safety advocates frequently credited Noreen with sparking a new era of awareness. Families of missing children who had once felt invisible now had someone speaking for them, someone who understood. She participated in community meetings, national conferences, and televised discussions. She spoke quietly, clearly, and often painfully about the realities of losing a child under mysterious circumstances. Her message remained the same wherever she went. We must never assume a child ran away. We must always investigate immediately. Time matters. Awareness matters. And every child matters. These words resonated with people who had never even heard Johnny's name: teachers, community leaders, law enforcement officers, parents. Her grief had become a call to action. When Noreen officially founded the Johnny Gosch Foundation, its purpose was simple yet profound: to educate parents and communities about the realities of child endangerment. The foundation distributed materials on warning signs, prevention strategies, community safety protocols, how to respond when children go missing, and how to support families during the critical first hours. Schools invited her to speak. Church groups organized safety workshops. Local media frequently updated viewers on new developments regarding Johnny's case. Everywhere she went, Noreen carried her son's memory like a torch, not as a symbol of tragedy, but as a symbol of awareness. The foundation's presence helped countless families understand the importance of vigilance. It reminded communities that child safety was not solely a police responsibility. It was a collective responsibility. And although she had begun her mission searching for one boy, she had become a defender for all children. As more attention was drawn to missing child issues nationwide, Johnny's case was increasingly referenced alongside other unresolved disappearances. The rise of dedicated missing persons databases and national alerts helped families across the country, but also highlighted just how many children had vanished without clear answers. Johnny's story became a kind of benchmark, an example of what happens when a case is mishandled in the early hours, what happens when the community is slow to react, and what happens when families are forced to advocate on their own. For law enforcement agencies studying past mistakes, the case was used in training programs, policy revisions, crisis management courses, and investigative seminars. Johnny's disappearance was no longer just a mystery. It had become a teaching moment for the entire country. Television documentaries in the early 2000s revisited the case, interviewing former investigators, journalists, and members of the community who remembered the events of 1982. These programs often highlighted the abandoned newspaper wagon, the hesitation of witnesses to call authorities, the initial runaway assumption, the unusual sightings and alleged messages, the emergence of new voices claiming connections, and the controversial account of Johnny's alleged late-night visit. Each documentary told the same story, but differently. Some portrayed hope, others portrayed fear, some questioned the validity of certain claims. Others leaned into the possibility of survival, but all agreed on one point: Johnny's disappearance was unlike anything the nation had seen. These documentaries kept the public invested, and they kept the case alive. Behind the public advocacy, behind the interviews and public appearances, the emotional burden on the Gosch family never lessened. Uncertainty creates a kind of grief that feels infinite. It does not fade with time. It does not settle. It simply shifts, becoming part of the daily rhythm of a family's life. For Noreen, birthdays were especially painful. Each one marked another year Johnny should have been home. Another year he might have lived in fear. Another year that she was forced to imagine what he might look like now. The question, "Where is he?" eventually became, "Where was he?" A subtle, heartbreaking shift that reflected decades of unanswered questions. Yet even in grief, Noreen held on to one truth: she would keep fighting as long as she lived. One of the striking aspects of Johnny's case was how deeply the public became involved. Viewers from across the country wrote letters offering support, sharing theories, and reporting possible sightings. Some mailed donations to help fund the search. Others reached out to share their own stories of missing children. In many ways, Johnny's case represented the power of community empathy. People who had never met him cared about what happened to him, and they cared about the truth. The outpouring of support reminded the Gosh family that they were not alone. A rare comfort in the world of long-term missing child cases, but public involvement also brought challenges. Rumors spread quickly, false leads emerged. People sometimes misinterpreted information, and speculation often overshadowed facts. Still, the story remained one the nation could not turn away from. Johnny's disappearance left behind a legacy that was at once inspiring and deeply complicated. On one hand, it created national reforms, greater awareness, better training, a stronger sense of community responsibility. On the other, it sparked debates that have lasted decades. What really happened that morning? Why were key steps not taken immediately? Did the witnesses recall the events accurately? Were the alleged sightings genuine? How much of the later testimony was factual? And what happened after the alleged late-night visit? Even now, these questions linger without clear answers. But in the history of true crime, some of the most influential cases have been the ones that remain unresolved, because they reveal gaps in systems, vulnerabilities in communities, and the resilience of families determined to find truth in the darkness. Johnny's case fits that pattern exactly. Over time, it became clear that Noreen Gosh was not simply a grieving mother. She had become a symbol, a representation of what it looks like when ordinary people stand up for justice, even when institutions fail them. Her voice had shaped legislation. Her persistence had shaped awareness. Her heartbreak had shaped a movement. And her love for Johnny remained at the center of everything she did. In interviews, she often described the case as a moral responsibility. She believed that sharing her story could save other families from experiencing the same pain. And she believed that as long as Johnny's story was told, his memory would never fade. By the late 2000s, Johnny's case had become a blend of historical record, active investigation, cultural phenomenon, emotional journey, and enduring mystery. Few cases have remained so prominent for so long. Few have inspired this level of debate. Few have left such a lasting impact. And though the official case file remains open, the lack of closure continues to haunt everyone who has ever followed Johnny's story. Because unresolved mysteries stay with us. They live in the back of our minds. They remind us that some answers remain just out of reach. But they also remind us to pay attention, to stay aware, and to care for the most vulnerable members of our communities. And perhaps that is the most powerful part of Johnny's legacy. As the second decade of the 2000s approached, the disappearance of Johnny Gosh remained a story suspended between eras, rooted in the early 1980s, yet continually resurfacing in modern conversations about child safety, investigative failures, and the weight of unresolved trauma. For many, the case felt like a haunting echo, always there, always whispering, always reminding us that some mysteries never settle. And for Noreen, that echo wasn't distant. It was persistent. It lived with her every day. Even decades after Johnny walked out into the early morning for his paper route, the threads of his story refused to snap. They stretched, they twisted, they tangled, but they never broke. And perhaps that is why this case endured, because the story never let go. With the rise of online true crime communities in the 2000s and 2010s, Johnny's case found new life. Users on forums, blogs, and early social media platforms began revisiting the details, examining timelines, comparing witness accounts, and questioning the missed opportunities of the original investigation. Younger generations, who were not alive when Johnny disappeared, became drawn to the case for its complexity, its unanswered questions, its emotional weight. People debated the credibility of the early witnesses, the legitimacy of the alleged messages found on dollar bills, the testimonies of young men who claimed they had encountered Johnny, the controversial late-night visit Noreen swore took place, and the possibility that organized networks could have been involved. Some discussions drifted toward speculation, but many approached the case with care, understanding that behind every detail was a real family, still longing for truth. The internet had revived thousands of cold cases, but few sparked as much wide-ranging discussion as the disappearance of Johnny Gosh. The case had become timeless, an enduring mystery that bridged generations. For families of the missing, hearing a name repeated for decades can be both comforting and painful. Comforting because it means the world hasn't forgotten. Painful because every mention is a reminder of what remains unresolved. Johnny's name became synonymous with advocacy action, uncertainty, and the enduring fight against child exploitation. His name appeared in college research papers, criminal justice courses, public policy discussions, documentaries, and national conversations about the safety of children. The Gosh family never asked for this. They never sought notoriety, but their tragedy shaped the way America responds when a child disappears. Johnny's name, repeated again and again across decades, became a reminder that children who vanish deserve far more than just initial attention. They deserve commitment, persistence, and truth. As the case regained attention online, journalists and independent researchers started revisiting key figures from the early investigation. Some witnesses had grown older. Some had moved away. Some were willing to share details they had never felt comfortable revealing in the 1980s. A few new reflections emerged. One former neighbor remembered the sound of a car accelerating loudly that morning, something he had initially dismissed as a teenage driver showing off. Another recalled the look of confusion on Johnny's dog, who had appeared at their yard alone shortly after the time Johnny would have passed their house. Someone else claimed that at the time, people in the neighborhood were hesitant to involve authorities unless absolutely necessary, reflecting a cultural mindset very different from today's expectations. These reflections didn't solve the case, but they added texture, a deeper understanding of the environment in which the disappearance occurred. They reminded the world that in 1982, people did not always interpret unusual events with the fear and urgency they might today. Years after the disappearance, the West Des Moines Police Department faced renewed scrutiny, not in a hostile way, but in a reflective one. New leadership, new detectives, and new investigative standards led many within the department to acknowledge, even indirectly, that mistakes had been made in the early hours of the case. Some officers admitted that the runaway assumption had been applied too quickly. Others acknowledged that witness reports should have been taken more seriously, and the department later implemented changes to prevent similar oversights in the future. These internal reflections highlighted the importance of learning from the past, even painful pasts. And though the acknowledgement came years after the fact, it represented an important moment in the legacy of the case. Because while justice for Johnny had not yet been achieved, improvements inspired by his story had made other children safer. By the late 2010s, a fresh wave of investigators, both official and independent, began re-examining the case with modern eyes. These were professionals who did not grow up with the original media coverage, were not influenced by earlier assumptions, had access to more sophisticated forensic and psychological tools, and approached decades-old evidence with new analytical techniques. Some were detectives, some were cold case specialists, some were digital researchers who pieced together timelines using modern data tools. While no breakthrough emerged, the new generation approached the case with a renewed sense of responsibility. They recognized that cases like Johnny's were important, not just for answers, but for understanding the patterns that could prevent future disappearances. And though they could not rewrite the past, they could help ensure that the mistakes of 1982 were not repeated. As time passed, public perception of Noreen began to shift in subtle but significant ways. In the early years, some critics had dismissed her resilience as denial. But as awareness of child exploitation grew, and as more cases nationwide revealed disturbing networks, people began to see her determination differently. They saw a mother who never accepted easy answers, a woman who fought for truth even when the world doubted her, a parent who spoke out long before the national conversation shifted, someone who refused to let her son's story be forgotten. Her earlier claims, once considered controversial, were now viewed through the lens of new information about trafficking cases that had come to light across the country. People who once questioned her began to understand how trauma shapes perspective, how a parent searching for a missing child sees possibilities that others overlook. And while not everyone agreed with every aspect of her story, a growing number respected the strength it took to carry the burden for so many years. Her voice, once met with skepticism, was increasingly recognized for what it had always been, a call to action, a plea for awareness, and a reminder that children deserve protection no matter how uncomfortable the truth may be. As true crime became one of the most consumed genres on streaming platforms and podcasts, Johnny's disappearance found its place among the most well-known unsolved cases of the modern era. It was discussed alongside the disappearance of Etan Patz, the kidnapping of J.C. Dugard, the case of Stephen Stainer, and other missing children's stories that reshaped national policies. What made Johnny's case so powerful was not only the tragedy, but the way the story evolved. It contained elements that captured the attention of audiences across decades. A quiet suburban setting, a sudden disappearance, conflicting accounts, unexplained sightings, anonymous messages, a resilient mother, a controversial alleged reunion, and the haunting fact that after all these years, no definitive truth has ever been found. This combination kept the mystery alive, not because it was sensational, but because it was deeply human. It forced people to confront how quickly a child can be taken, how fragile safety can be, and how deeply a family can suffer in the absence of closure. Even now, the disappearance of Johnny Gosh remains unresolved. There is no conclusive evidence of what happened, no definitive confirmation of survival or death, no final chapter. Instead, the case remains open, suspended between hope and heartbreak, and perhaps that is why Johnny's story continues to resonate. Because some mysteries do not fade. Some remain alive, shifting with each new generation that discovers them. And this case, more than most, reminds us of one painful truth. When a child vanishes without explanation, the lack of answers becomes its own kind of shadow, one that stretches across years, across states, across lives. And until the truth is found, that shadow remains. Decades have passed since the early morning when Johnny Gosh vanished. The world of 1982 feels distant now, a time before smartphones, before real-time alerts, before digital security cameras and online communities dedicated to solving cold cases. Yet despite the evolution of technology, the advancement of investigative methods, and the growing sophistication of forensic science, the truth about what happened to Johnny has not surfaced. No confession, no recovery, no definitive evidence. Just one lingering, persistent uncertainty, and a mother who refused to allow her son's story to disappear into the silence. But with each new decade came new challenges. Challenges not only for the investigation, but for the people who lived within the shadow of the case itself. While Noreen pushed forward with unwavering determination, the emotional weight of the case affected the Gosh family in profound and lasting ways. Grief does not always bring people closer. Sometimes it fractures what was once whole. Those close to the family later shared that the stress, the constant searching, the unending media presence, and the emotional toll of the unknown placed unimaginable pressure on their relationships. Different family members coped in different ways. Some withdrew quietly. Some focused on work to escape the pain. Some supported the search but struggled emotionally with its intensity. Noreen stood at the center of the storm, the face of the search, the spokesperson for Johnny, and the one who carried the weight of unanswered questions day after day, year after year. It was a burden no parent should ever have to bear, but one she accepted with heartbreaking resolve. In the world of true crime, families are often judged through the harsh lens of public opinion. Investigations become entertainment, speculation becomes conversation, and grief becomes something people analyze rather than empathize with. As Johnny's case became more widely known, the Gosh family found themselves under a spotlight that was not always kind. Some questioned their choices. Some doubted their memories. Some scrutinized their interviews, looking for inconsistencies or explanations that fit their own theories. For ordinary people thrust into extraordinary circumstances, the pressure was crushing. Noreen, in particular, was often targeted. Some accused her of exaggerating. Some questioned her mental and emotional state. Some argued she misinterpreted certain events. Others believed she held on to hope for too long. But criticism never stopped her. Even when the world questioned her, she refused to stop questioning the world. It was not pride. It was not denial. It was love, a mother's devotion that remained unbroken, even when the rest of her life seemed to fracture around her. Years turned into decades. Technology advanced, generations changed, new investigative tools emerged. And yet the case remained exactly where it had always been. Open, unresolved, haunting. The slow march of time is one of the cruelest forces in missing person cases. Memories fade, witnesses pass away, documents become lost, physical evidence deteriorates, and leads that once seemed promising evaporate into thin air. As time moved forward, the pool of people with first-hand knowledge of that September morning grew smaller. Those who remembered the details most clearly were aging, their stories becoming softer, more fragile. Yet the memory of that day never faded entirely, because Johnny's case remained woven into the identity of West Des Moines. It was a story whispered across generations. A story parents told their children as a warning. A story that shaped how the community understood safety. Some residents never forgot the sound of police sirens that morning. Others never forgot seeing the empty wagon. Some carried guilt for not speaking sooner. Others wished they had noticed something they missed. The entire town, knowingly or not, became part of the legacy of the case. With every passing decade, journalists, researchers, and curious minds revisited the same lingering questions. Why wasn't the abduction immediately reported? Why did multiple witnesses hesitate to call authorities? Why did law enforcement cling to the runaway theory? Why were early leads not followed more aggressively? Who was the man in the car? Did the alleged Oklahoma sighting reflect the truth? Were the messages written on the dollar bills genuine? Who were the young men who claimed to have seen Johnny? Did the late-night visit truly occur? And if it did, where did Johnny go afterward? These questions have hovered over the case like a fog, visible, present, always there, yet impossible to grasp fully. Every attempt to answer them leads to more uncertainty. Every theory, no matter how carefully constructed, contains gaps. Every claim brings new doubts. That is the nature of unsolved mysteries. They keep asking questions long after the world has stopped searching. With so many pieces missing, Noreen's memory became one of the strongest surviving components of the investigation. She remembered the sound of Johnny's voice, the way he walked, his handwriting, his habits, his fears, his hopes. These memories guided her beliefs, shaped her theories, and fueled the search. But memories, even the most precious ones, can be both reliable and fragile. They can illuminate the truth or distort it through emotional weight. This duality created challenges. Supporters felt that Noreen's intuition held truths others had ignored. Skeptics feared her memories had been shaped by trauma and longing. Yet no one could deny that her memories kept the case alive. They ensured Johnny's story was never left behind. They provided the emotional backbone for the entire investigation. Without Noreen's voice, the case might have faded into history long ago. Even without answers, the disappearance of Johnny Gosch changed the country. Laws passed in the 1980s, 1990s, and beyond drew from lessons learned from his case and others like it. These included faster response requirements, mandatory immediate investigation of missing children, better coordination between local and federal agencies, and improved public alert systems. While these policies did not bring Johnny home, they prevented countless other tragedies, and this became part of the legacy Noreen carried with her. A painful reminder that while she had not been able to protect her own child, her efforts helped protect many others. Her work helped ensure that children would not be dismissed as runaways in the crucial early hours of disappearance. It helped ensure that parents would be taken seriously. And it helped ensure that communities understood the urgency of reporting suspicious activity. Johnny's story may not have been resolved, but it changed the system forever. One of the most powerful yet painful themes in this case has always been hope. Hope kept Noreen searching. Hope kept the public invested. Hope kept the case alive. But hope, when stretched across decades, becomes a difficult companion. It comforts and wounds. It fuels persistence and exhaustion. It uplifts and torments. For families of the missing, hope is a double-edged sword, keeping them going, but never letting them rest. In Johnny's case, hope remained constant because his story never reached a definitive conclusion. There was no farewell, no closure, no final answer. And so hope lingered, quietly, painfully, relentlessly. Even for people who never met Johnny, never visited West Des Moines, and never experienced a missing child investigation firsthand, this case feels deeply personal. Perhaps because Johnny's story reflects the fear every parent carries. Perhaps because it highlights how vulnerable children can be. Perhaps because it exposes flaws that once existed, and in some places still exist, in the systems meant to protect the innocent. Or perhaps because, at its core, this is a human story. A boy who should have come home, a family who never stopped searching, a community forced to confront the fragility of safety, and a world reminded that some mysteries never let go. Johnny's story touches something universal: the fear of loss, the search for truth, and the longing for justice. And until answers are found, that connection will remain. Decades have passed since the morning Johnny Gosh disappeared. Time has softened some memories, sharpened others, and blurred the line between what is certain and what remains speculation. Some cold cases fade because the world forgets. Johnny's case endures because the world cannot. It is a story woven with pain, determination, confusion, and possibility. A story that refuses to rest. One that still lives in the minds of investigators, parents, researchers, and everyday people who were struck by the tragedy of a child vanishing without explanation. And as the years stretched onward, Johnny became more than a single missing boy. He became a symbol, a reminder of the fragility of safety and the importance of awareness. By the late 2010s and early 2020s, advancements in forensic science and digital technology had transformed how missing child cases were approached. Today, investigators rely on GPS data surveillance footage, facial recognition tools, DNA databases, cell phone triangulation, digital footprints, and instant communication systems. None of these tools existed when Johnny disappeared. If they had, the case might have taken a very different path. Modern investigators who studied the case frequently commented on how different the original investigation would look today. A missing child is now treated with immediate urgency. Alerts go out instantly. Communities mobilize fast. Authorities take early witness accounts seriously. Johnny's case became a powerful example of why these changes were needed. And though he did not benefit from today's tools, thousands of other children have. As technology advanced, some investigators wondered whether old evidence from the case could be re-examined with modern techniques, but the challenge was significant. Much of the early evidence had been limited, incomplete, or not preserved in a way that allowed for new testing. Witness memories had faded. Paper records had been lost or degraded over time. Photographs lacked clarity. Timelines contained gaps that could no longer be reconstructed. Still, a few individual details remained: the abandoned newspaper wagon, the unknown man in the Ford Fairmont, the sighting of Johnny speaking to another paperboy, the reports of two men forcing a child into a vehicle, the tire screeching noise witnesses later recalled, the alleged Oklahoma sighting, the dollar bills bearing written messages, the testimonies from young men who claimed contact, and the controversial late-night visit. Each of these details had been examined, dissected, debated, and recorded, again and again by different investigators across decades. Yet none of them, individually or combined, revealed the complete truth. Even in a world of advanced forensic tools, some mysteries remain resistant to resolution. What makes the disappearance of Johnny Gosh so enduring and so difficult is the presence of doubt at nearly every stage. Doubt about early witness statements, doubt about law enforcement's initial response, doubt about the veracity of later testimonies, doubt about possible sightings, doubt about the messages written on currency, doubt about the alleged late-night reunion, doubt about whether Johnny truly survived beyond that morning. Perhaps because Johnny's story reflects the fear every parent carries. Perhaps because it highlights how vulnerable children can be. Perhaps because it exposes flaws that once existed, and in some places still exist, in the systems meant to protect the innocent. Or perhaps because, at its core, this is a human story. A boy who should have come home. A family who never stopped searching. A community forced to confront the fragility of safety, and a world reminded that some mysteries never let go. Johnny's story touches something universal: the fear of loss, the search for truth, and the longing for justice. And until answers are found, that connection will remain. Decades have passed since the morning Johnny Gosh disappeared. Time has softened some memories, sharpened others, and blurred the line between what is certain and what remains speculation. Some cold cases fade because the world forgets. Johnny's case endures because the world cannot. It is a story woven with pain, determination, confusion, and possibility. A story that refuses to rest. One that still lives in the minds of investigators, parents, researchers, and everyday people who were struck by the tragedy of a child vanishing without explanation. And as the years stretched onward, Johnny became more than a single missing boy. He became a symbol, a reminder of the fragility of safety and the importance of awareness. By the late 2010s and early 2020s, advancements in forensic science and digital technology had transformed how missing child cases were approached. Today, investigators rely on GPS data, surveillance footage, facial recognition tools, DNA databases, cell phone triangulation, digital footprints, and instant communication systems. None of these tools existed when Johnny disappeared. If they had, the case might have taken a very different path. Modern investigators who studied the case frequently commented on how different the original investigation would look today. A missing child is now treated with immediate urgency. Alerts go out instantly. Communities mobilize fast. Authorities take early witness accounts seriously. Johnny's case became a powerful example of why these changes were needed. And though he did not benefit from today's tools, thousands of other children have. As technology advanced, some investigators wondered whether old evidence from the case could be re-examined with modern techniques. But the challenge was significant. Much of the early evidence had been limited, incomplete, or not preserved in a way that allowed for new testing. Witness memories had faded. Paper records had been lost or degraded over time. Photographs lacked clarity. Timelines contained gaps that could no longer be reconstructed. Still, a few individual details remained. The abandoned newspaper wagon, the unknown man in the Ford Fairmont, the sighting of Johnny speaking to another paperboy, the reports of two men forcing a child into a vehicle, the tire screeching noise witnesses later recalled, the alleged Oklahoma sighting, the dollar bills bearing written messages, the testimonies from young men who claim contact, and the controversial late-night visit. Each of these details had been examined, dissected, debated, and recorded, again and again, by different investigators across decades. Yet none of them, individually or combined, revealed the complete truth. Even in a world of advanced forensic tools, some mysteries remain resistant to resolution. What makes the disappearance of Johnny Gosh so enduring and so difficult is the presence of doubt at nearly every stage. Doubt about early witness statements, doubt about law enforcement's initial response, doubt about the veracity of later testimonies, doubt about possible sightings, doubt about the messages written on currency, doubt about the alleged late-night reunion, doubt about whether Johnny truly survived beyond that morning. Doubt can be corrosive. It erodes trust, it fuels speculation, and it creates an emotional landscape where truth and fear blur together. But in cases where answers never arrive, doubt becomes the only constant. For the Gosh family, doubt was both torment and motivation. It left them wondering what was real and what was imagined. It made them question every detail, every memory, every lead. And yet, doubt also kept them searching. It prevented them from settling into resignation. It forced them to keep pushing for answers, even when those answers felt hopelessly out of reach. As the years progressed, entire generations grew up hearing Johnny's name through documentaries, podcasts, and articles. Many were not alive when he vanished, yet felt a connection to the story, a sense of injustice that demanded attention. But while the world changed around it, the case itself remained still. No new evidence emerged. No significant breakthroughs were reported. No definitive confirmation of survival or death surfaced. The investigations continued quietly, intermittently, but never conclusively. Johnny's case became a reminder of how time can stand still for families affected by disappearances. The world continues, children grow up, technology evolves, communities change, but the missing remain frozen at the age they left. For Johnny, that age is 12, forever 12, forever locked in a year the world cannot forget. Even decades later, the people of West Des Moines remember the case vividly. Some residents recall the flyers taped to storefront windows. Others remember searching fields in wooded areas. Many remember learning for the first time that safety could be shattered in an instant. For those who were children at the time, Johnny's disappearance became a defining moment of their childhood. The day they learned that danger existed even in quiet neighborhoods. And in that way, the case became a shared memory for the entire community. A moment that shaped how parents watch their children. A moment that shifted the culture of trust in small towns. A moment that taught people to look twice, to be aware, to speak up. Silent lessons from a tragedy that never found closure. Though the truth about Johnny's fate remains unknown, one outcome of the case is undeniable. It helped change how America protects its children. Advocates believe the push for better missing child protocols, the emergence of national alert systems, the rise of child safety education, and the shift toward immediate investigation were all influenced, at least in part, by cases like Johnny's. Noreen's voice, powerful and persistent, forced society to confront uncomfortable gaps. Her efforts helped inspire reforms that reduced tragedies for other families. And though she would give anything to rewrite the past, her impact has saved children she will never meet. That is the bittersweet truth of some tragedies. Sometimes they become catalysts for change. Today, Johnny's disappearance is frequently referenced in true crime documentaries, university courses, law enforcement training sessions, investigative articles, and discussions about missing child protocols. It has become a case study in the importance of early action, the devastating cost of hesitation, the need for interagency cooperation, the risks of mislabeling a child as a runaway, and the enduring power of advocacy. Modern viewers often express shock that a case with so many witnesses, so many clues, and so much attention could still remain unresolved. It is a reminder that even with public awareness, some mysteries resist resolution. Because mysteries are not solved by attention alone, they are solved by information. And the one individual who could reveal that information has never been found. It is a question asked by everyone who has followed this case. Will the truth ever surface? Possibly, perhaps not. Some cold cases have broken open 50 years later. Others remain silent forever. Sometimes answers come from a forgotten letter, a deathbed confession, a long-buried file, a witness who finally chooses to speak, or a piece of evidence overlooked for decades. Other times, the truth fades with the passing of those who knew it. In Johnny's case, the possibility remains open. Not guaranteed, not promised, but possible. And as long as possibility exists, some part of the case remains alive. As this investigation stretches across 4 decades, the disappearance of Johnny Gosh stands as one of the most enduring mysteries in American history. It is a story of a boy who disappeared, a family that never stopped searching, a community forever changed, a nation forced to look at the gaps in its systems, and a mother whose voice became a beacon for countless others. But it is also a story without an ending. One where the final chapter has never been written. One where the truth remains hidden in shadows. And perhaps that is why the world cannot forget. Because unfinished stories linger. They stay with us. They remind us of what we do not yet know. Johnny Gosh's story is one of those rare mysteries that time has not erased. Not because of tragedy alone, but because of love, courage, and a quest for truth that refuses to fade. And so, after more than 4 decades, after countless interviews, headlines, sightings, claims, doubts, and unanswered questions, we arrive at a place that every long-standing cold case eventually reaches. A crossroads between what we know, what we believe, and what we may never learn. The disappearance of Johnny Gosh is not just an old mystery. It is a story that shaped a nation's understanding of missing children. A story that exposed weaknesses in early investigative systems. A story that demanded better responses, better protections, and better awareness. But at its heart, it is the story of a 12-year-old boy who left home one morning to deliver newspapers and never returned. A boy whose empty wagon still symbolizes one of the most haunting, unsolved cases in American history. A boy whose life, innocence, and dreams were taken from him before he ever had a chance to grow up. A boy whose disappearance changed the way we view safety forever. And though the world has changed, evolved, and moved forward, Johnny's case has remained exactly where it began, without closure. What makes this story unforgettable is not only its mystery, but the extraordinary perseverance of one woman, Noreen Gosh, a mother who refused to give up, a mother who refused to be silent, a mother who kept searching long after the world moved on, a mother who fought for her son's memory even when people questioned, doubted, and challenged her every step. Some agreed with her beliefs, some did not, but no one can deny the strength behind her voice. Her advocacy changed laws. Her persistence educated millions. Her story inspired protections that continue to save children today. And whether one believes every detail she shared or not, one truth remains undeniable. She loved her son with a force that reshaped the nation. Johnny's disappearance taught the world something many had never considered. Children are vulnerable even in the safest neighborhoods, even in the most ordinary moments, even in the spaces parents assume are harmless. His story became a warning, a call for vigilance, a reminder that danger does not always look like danger. Sometimes it looks like a quiet street, a familiar route, a trusting moment. And because of Johnny, countless children today grow up in a safer world, one with faster alert systems, stricter protocols, and a society that takes missing children far more seriously than it once did. His story may not have found justice, but it did create change. After everything, after the theories, the sightings, the testimonies, the investigations, the hopes, and the heartbreak, we are left with three unshakable truths. Truth number one, a 12-year-old boy disappeared on a quiet September morning, and what happened to him remains unknown. Truth number two, his case transformed the way America responds when a child goes missing. Truth number three, someone, somewhere, still knows the truth. Perhaps the answers rest in a memory someone has chosen to bury. Perhaps they lie in old documents or unspoken confessions. Perhaps the truth will emerge one day when the last remaining person involved decides to speak. Or perhaps some mysteries stay hidden forever. But as long as Johnny's story is told, as long as his name is spoken, as long as we continue to ask what happened, his memory remains alive. And his case continues to remind us of the importance of awareness, compassion, and vigilance. Johnny Gosch's disappearance is not simply a story from the past. It is a story that still lives in the present, a story that warns, teaches, and resonates, a story that asks us to look out for one another, to be aware, to speak up, to protect our children, and to remember that in the absence of answers, humanity must never turn away. For Noreen, for the community, for all the families who know the pain of not knowing, this story is not just history. It is a reminder, a plea, a legacy. And until the truth comes to light, however long it takes, Johnny's case remains one of the most significant, painful, and unforgettable mysteries in American true crime history. Thank you for joining us on this journey through one of the most enduring missing child cases of our time. If you found this story meaningful, please like, comment, and hit the subscribe button to support Beyond the Case and to help keep stories like this alive. Until next time, stay safe, stay aware, and take care of one another.